So first of all, could Alexander Kalamov come here right now, please? And secondly, I'll introduce Bennett Foddy, the next speaker, who is going to talk about a topic that we have already touched on during the meeting, and which is entitled Allocating Resources for Rejuvenation Therapies.
Great, thanks Aubrey. So one of the biggest problems in my field, which is medical ethics, is to work out how to justify the cost of medicines and how to ration them out between people. And what we currently do is we give almost absolute priority to providing medical interventions that save the lives of individuals who are dying from a disease or a disorder. Except in rare circumstances, a person who presents with any life-threatening problem will be treated. Alan Johnson calls this the rule of rescue. Rule of rescue is not a single law or a policy. It's more of a psychological disposition or a philosophical stance that characterizes the way we provide medicines throughout the Western world. When someone's life can be saved, we don't take into account how much voluntary risk they've taken on, what their ability to pay is, how many more years they'll live, more or less, or even in most cases how expensive the therapy will be. If there's some curative intervention that can provide a number of healthy additional years of life to a person, it's nearly always provided. The UK's National Health Service, the NHS, does some rationing of life-saving treatment, but in practice, a treatment that restores normal life expectancy, even if normal life expectancy is very short to a person, is only rationed if it costs more than £1 million per patient. Prophylactic medicines, by contrast, are heavily rationed according to cost, demand, and effectiveness. Now I see this as an issue for rejuvenation medicine, because it's most natural to think about anti-aging medicines as being a form of prophylaxis, preventative medicine. Rather than saving someone from impending death, rejuvenation medicines, at least if you view them as a group, make it statistically less likely that you'll seek medical help in the future for a range of age-related complaints. And so at present, anti-aging therapies are viewed as being elective, prophylactic, inessential interventions, and funding for them is very poor if they're even offered at all. The UK, again, is relatively proactive in this sense in terms of the global health community, in providing preventive medicine, preventive treatment for age-related diseases like heart disease. So you could take the example of statin therapy. The NHS now spends £500 million a year, which is 2.5% of its drug budget, on statins to prevent heart disease in people with high cholesterol. The statins are almost cheap enough now that it looks like this £500 million will soon be completely offset by the savings in terms of giving people surgery and other interventions later in their lives, at least according to one estimate I read recently. But even so, there's this very strong political and public backlash against the use of public funds to provide statin therapy, partly because it doesn't save the life of an identifiable individual with a life-threatening problem. And you see, I mean, here it's still a tiny proportion of the budget. You can compare the percentage of the drug budget that goes to statins to the proportion of people who will die of heart disease, which is a third. But the real issue for rejuvenation medicine, like most prophylactic medicine, is that research budgets are very low. The budget for researching preventative medicine for common diseases is minuscule compared to the budget for researching curative medicines, and anti-aging is no exception to this. I don't need to tell any of you that the funding into anti-aging research from public funders is too low. But I'm trying to give a different view on why this is, which is anti-aging treatments don't appear to rescue anybody from a life-threatening disease or disorder, and I'll come back to that. And one practical effect of the rule of rescue is that the most recent gains in lifespan are being obtained in the worst possible way, by saving people's lives shortly before they die of some age-related complaint. And by doing that, we ensure both that costs balloon and that the people whose lives are saved have the lowest possible quality of life. And costs balloon because when people are very frail, it's much harder to keep them alive and much more expensive. You need more surgery, more pharmaceuticals, and crucially, more nursing support. And quality of life is diminished because you extend only the period of life in which the person has already passed their best years, where they're being worst afflicted by the processes of aging. We do nothing proactive to reverse the aging process. According to John Wilmoth, out of the 40 years of lifespan that we've gained over the past century and a half, only 10 of those were youthful years, and the other 30 were decrepit old age years of life. In this plot, you can see how the difference between a person's life expectancy and their healthy life expectancy is largest in the countries which have made the biggest gains in terms of total life expectancy. Now, right now, preventative medicine is about as cost-effective as cure, although we spend a huge amount more on cure. So that's bad enough in itself. But if rejuvenation medicine is a success, if it's as big a success as I know a lot of you think it will be, rejuvenation therapies will offer many more years of life at much higher quality, much more cheaply than traditional life-saving interventions. So you might hope that that kind of radical cost-effectiveness divide would be enough to persuade people to spend more money on rejuvenation than on rescue. Might be enough to overturn the rule of rescue in this case. But you have to understand that we're talking about extremely dramatic change in medical culture and medical policy for that to happen. If we spend a lot on rejuvenation, that means we have to refuse a certain amount of life-saving treatments for people who might have been saved, given a small amount of very poor quality life. So that would require this kind of colossal cultural shift and a host of new philosophical justifications for doing that. But I think in the end it might not matter how cost-effective SENS is. I mean, if a life-extending intervention doesn't save the life of an identifiable person in an identifiable way, people just won't want to divert resources to that and away from other sorts of life-saving therapies. And you can actually see the beginnings of this crisis in the controversy over statin therapy or in the provision of Alzheimer's drugs like donepezil, which was removed for many years from NHS funding, I think until just last year. Alzheimer's drugs and statins you can see as a kind of test case for rejuvenation medicine. And the indication is it's going to be a major struggle to get everything funded, even in the kind of most minor way possible. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, but aging is a kind of disease, and rejuvenation medicine rescues you from it in a way. It saves your life. Now, we've had a rich debate in the past over whether aging is a disease. I know Aubrey thinks it's a disease. Many of you probably think it's a disease. But most people seem to think it's a natural function of the body, and there are people who even think that calling it a disease, even if it is a disease, is the same thing as devaluing elderly people and discriminating against them. But even if we all agreed that age was a disease, it's not the kind of disease that you can be rescued from under current medical policies. So diseases don't threaten life. Symptoms threaten life, right? Not the underlying diseases. But by the time age, if we say age is a disease, by the time it produces symptoms that visibly threaten your life, it's too late to treat it in the best, most cost-effective, quality-preserving way anyway. Now, even if you could win the argument that early intervention rejuvenation is a way of rescuing us from the disease of old age, you face another problem, which relates to how life-saving treatments are assessed and rationed. So what does it mean to rescue someone from a disease? Well, here's the orthodox view in the medical community. It means you return someone to a normal life expectancy for their age. So this concept of a normal life expectancy is used in NHS cost-benefit calculations to define the maximum effect a treatment can have. If a treatment restores you to normal life expectancy for your age, it gets funded unless it's astronomically expensive. So we do that, we have that rule because we think people have a right to live their natural lifespan. But what about when you have a treatment that actually increases your lifespan? Now, every rejuvenation therapy, by definition, will change a person's lifespan. And I think as soon as it becomes clear that the point of these medicines is to increase lifespan, they're aiming at increasing lifespan, the argument will be that we're doing more than what the rule of rescue asks us to do. We're giving people more medicine than they have a right to, more life than they have a right to. So I've posed a set of problems here, and I'm going to close just by offering two little ideas for ways of approaching this problem. So the first idea is just this. We could decide that the rule of rescue doesn't make sense anymore when we've got really effective rejuvenation medicine. So we could try to eliminate it from our healthcare system and find other ways of determining where our medical resources should go. And I think this is the most philosophically satisfying option, but I think it's also a very impractical thing to recommend in a way. It's going to be very unlikely to happen in the short term because it requires this massive political and cultural shift. It goes against these sort of basic psychological biases. So another alternative would be more cynical, more practical, and a more short-term strategy, which is this. Stop calling it anti-aging medicine, right? We could label the causes of age, the processes of age, as individual slow-acting fatal diseases and present life-extending medicine as a series of treatments for widespread disease epidemics. So the case of Alzheimer's disease would be an example of how we could do that. So rather than talking about glycation, we could call it cellular glycation disease, right? If it turned out that genes that govern mitophagic turnover are downregulated as you get old, you could call it congenital mitochondrial inflammatory disease. Now, that might seem kind of farcical and silly to you, but consider heart disease, right? Consider dementia, which is sometimes called a disease, sometimes called a syndrome. Nobody ever says that dementia is a normal function of the human organism, but they do say that about age. So it's actually harder to justify the idea that heart disease is a disease than that oxidation or glycation are diseases, right? So the other part of this is that you'd have to test people for the earliest symptoms of these diseases. So glycation end products, systemic inflammation, and so on and so forth. You'd actually have to test, you'd have to develop tests that can diagnose a person with this early in their life and then really support the claim that your treatments are rescuing people from a life-threatening illness. To find safe limits of myelin deterioration, to find some level of inflammation as high, that would make it a lot more attractive to the politicians, to the doctors, to the medical boards, to the voters. And I think it would do something to offset the problems and the challenge of the rule of rescue. So I think this is an example of an area where the conceptual work is practically significant. It's one of the things that's holding back scientific funding and medical funding in this area. So I think we need a coordinated effort at getting clear about why people should get longevity medicine instead of life-saving medicine. And if we don't do that, it's hard to see how we'll ever get the funding that we need for this stuff. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Bennett. That was extremely interesting. We've got time for a couple of questions. Harry? Behind you.
I fully agree with your ideas, but for a number of reasons, other than mentioned by you. We do know that about 95% of the healthcare budget is spent on so-called curative or end-of-life medicine, and 5% only on preventive. In the eyes of the general public, preventive medicine is not very sexy. People love to see a surgeon on TV, but not you giving a lecture on the topic you just did. So I think the question is, at the age of 20, when our children can reproduce, we already start dying. So my suggestion would be, start a political movement or party. Don't you want to die from the age of 20? Join the club and change the budget from 5 to 95%.
I mean, yeah, some sort of redefinition of what it counts to be dying. I mean, that's part of what it's almost one of the sort of things that I'm suggesting that we could do.
Slowly rotting away is a way of dying.
Right. But it needs to be framed in such a way that people can see it as the interventions are addressing that, are saving you, rather than just increasing your odds of living longer.
Actually, there is one sector of business and commerce that is very much interested in maintaining health and selling their activities and such, and that is the food industry. The food industry is promoting products, at least the ones that are interested in the positive effects of supporting good health, like Unilever and Nestle. They're producing products to maintain vascular health, maintain metabolic health, maintain joint health, maintain neurological health under the guise of wellness. So maybe, you need to look also at the food sector, not just the pharmaceutical sector and medical sector, because there is one sector, if bioactives in some food products can help sustain wellness and good health, then, this is an area where a lot of money is going in to drive this type of research.
I think it's a really good suggestion. I think one of the things is that the problems that we have with existing medicines like statin therapy is there's very low adherence to anything that's deemed to be prophylactic, but people adhere much better to food, supplemented foods. So it's not a crazy idea.
Michael.
So you gave us one of the examples as a cautionary tale. Donepezil and the other drugs in that class, whose name is escaping me right now. Thank you. Cholinesterase inhibitors, acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, as examples, as a cautionary tale in terms of, we are not willing to give these drugs to people because they restore function rather than because they actually save a life immediately. The real reason why the NHS wasn't willing to fund those drugs was because although they could improve scores on arbitrary memory scales, they actually couldn't improve function as assessed by caregivers or by family members. Whereas a rejuvenation approach is, if it is bona fide rejuvenation, is actually genuinely going to improve those people's lives and their function. So I don't think that's a really worrying counterexample, because the whole point was they really don't work in any meaningful functional way.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that I'm endorsing that we spend a huge amount of money on existing Alzheimer's drugs. I was sort of just saying.
No, I didn't take it to be
I'm trying to refer more to the broad public and political discourse on those drugs, which isn't about whether they're effective for the most part. It's just about not being attracted to sort of preventive quality of life care, and people think it's a waste of money.
Just have one more question, quick answer.
Sure. I really agree with the way that your idea of sort of characterizing the etiologies of the diseases as diseases unto itself. That's really cool. One of the things that occurred to me while I was listening to your talk is I'm from Canada. I'm under a public healthcare system too. I love it to tears. But I think the private insurance model is, as much as it pains me to say it, much more compatible with the idea of people having the foresight to invest in advance to save themselves money in the future. And I wonder whether, at least for the percentage of people in the United States who have the capacity to have that insurance, whether it wouldn't kick in faster to invest the money in therapies that would put off heavier costs in the future.
So, sorry, I'm not clear on what your question is.
Well, I just wondered what you think of that, and whether there's what the effect, I guess, would that be of on the NHS, for instance, of seeing, the United States invest a lot of money into rejuvenation therapy. Wouldn't that automatically have an effect?
Well, yeah, I mean, it would. There is a constant criticism of the NHS that it sort of waits to see what's happening in countries like the United States that don't have socialised medicine, and then using that as the sort of trial ground. So.
Thanks. Okay, thanks very much, Bennett.